It's the week ending Saturday, the 10th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Freemasons revealed to be operating within the UK Parliament, Elon Musk launching a car into bloody space, and the Super Bowl ending with a narrow win for the Philly Eagles. Go Eagles. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me from the week's digital team are Timson, Rebecca Gillie and Kari Wilkin. Starting the show this week, it's Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This is the week we were all asking, where's the beef?
You like murdering plants and trees. I
like moderation. Moderation game.
No, I like eating meat because the best animals in the jungle eat meat. Lions eat meat.
I don't.
Tigers eat meat.
I like a bit of
Leopards
fish.
eat meat.
We need to eat.
I like the way you're equating yourself with the king of the jungle.
You do like that subtle, isn't it?
The sound of news journalism on ITV's Good Morning Britain earlier this month. Afua Hirsch speaking to Piers Morgan and Susanna Reid. Rebecca, what's the story from this week?
So the story from this week is a study which found that 29% of the meals Brits were eating for dinner in the 12 weeks up to the end of January were vegan or vegetarian.
29%?
Yeah.
So that's 1 in 4-ish, more than 1 in 4.
Yeah, more than a quarter of our evening meals, according to this, are now vegetarian or vegan. That is skewed slightly because it was Veganuary.
Veganuary.
So obviously that has skewed upwards, but that's still up from, I think it was 26% last year and 27% the year before that. So that is still a rise. And also, Veganuary, while we're on the subject, the statistics from this year showed that 167,000 people signed up for this January compared to 60,000 last year.
Okay, so is this just a food trend for 2018, basically a fad, or do you think there's something else going on here?
Well, there's a few factors to it. Just briefly, there's the availability now of vegan food. It's easier to buy vegan and vegetarian meals, and obviously, you know, the easier it is, the more people take it up. And
Kari, you're nodding along. It's always been easy to buy vegetables.
But apparently vegetable sales are up, so clearly it's, it's not as though that's changed. People do actually seem to want to eat more vegetables.
First, it's easier and cheaper to buy meat substitute products, and they are, I would say, broadly of a better quality than.
So what are you talking about here, like corn, basically?
Yeah, stuff like corn, but there's a big variety now where you can get basically a meat-free version of anything. It used to be like, I remember going to my vegetarian friend's house when we were like 10, and it was the most horrific bacon substitute you can imagine. It was just like, it was like super thin pate, almost had that texture.
Jamie, are you a hardline meat eater?
I was vegetarian from 0 to the age of 17.
Ah.
And then I saw the light, as it were. Partly the reason that I changed was that I didn't want to be my vegetarian friend. I found it quite awkward being the person that people had to provide specific meals for. I think now, if I was 17 again, to quote a phrase, I would probably continue being vegetarian because of the ease of everything. I think partly when you're a teenager, you don't like anything that makes you stand out.
Presumably your parents are vegetarian then?
My dad is still vegetarian,
So
and my stepmom. My mum actually saw the light earlier and then lied
I love the
to
way
me,
you keep saying saw the light.
pretended to me that she was vegetarian for a little bit longer than she was.
Like having a secret cigarette.
Yeah, but we did for a long time have vegetarian meals, particularly also because I think that there are lots and lots of ways that you don't have to have meat in your diet.
It's pretty easy not to.
One of the other big factors is that the kinds of foods we eat have changed a lot. Because if you take, the classic old British meal, like say you bangers mashed peas, you take the bangers away and you've got quite a sad remainder. Whereas, now we're eating more curries, stir fries,
That's
different
interesting.
cuisines around the world.
He says, as if the other bit wasn't. But that is interesting, isn't it? The influence of immigration on our vegetarianism.
When you can put tofu or paneer, if you're willing to eat cheese, all kinds of things now that you can just chuck in there and it doesn't feel like you're missing out on the core component. All of our traditional British meals are kind of built around a meat.
Okay, so is this a good thing or a bad thing? One of the reasons people say we should eat less meat is to do with the implications on climate change, carbon emissions and all the rest of it.
For the planet, it's amazing.
Is it?
Yes, it is.
It's a huge factor. I think livestock production contributes nearly 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than the transportation sector.
But what about, transporting avocados from Mexico? I mean, we don't hear much about that. Do mangoes from Israel and all the rest of it? They all come from other places.
Thing, the Bolivian farmers that now no longer can eat quinoa. No one in Bolivia can eat quinoa because or quinoa, I don't mind how it's pronounced, because Western Europe has like completely decimated their ability to buy their own crops that they're growing in the country.
But in that case, is it more a case that we should be eating seasonal food, seasonal
stuff that
local
comes from,
food?
But to be fair, there is a movement for that.
Okay, so seasonal local food, that would include things like chickens and fish that we have here, right?
Yeah, I think, but it can be done sustainably. And this is the thing, this is what's really interesting to me about this story, is that for a long time it's been sort of phrased in this oppositional way, like everyone should become vegetarian or vegan, and if you're a meat eater, you immediately think, well, no, that's never going to happen. I'm never going to give up meat. Whereas it's actually been more of like a silent revolution.
Flexitarianism, that's really spread, isn't it?
And flexitarianism, Kari, what does that mean?
That just means you reduce your meat consumption overall. You're not being fully vegetarian, but on some days perhaps you'll follow that kind of diet.
Also, what I think is interesting is the idea of the meat substitute. I actually think that eating a meat substitute is in a way kind of just silly. Like, I don't understand the point in eating corn, steak and ale pie. I mean, obviously, yes, if you really enjoy the taste of steak and ale pie, then. But there are so many good recipes out there that don't need to use corn and don't need to use fake meat.
A lot of people do really enjoy meat, and meat has its own special texture. And my partner actually was just raving about these mushroom sausages that he ate, that he said were exactly the same as meat. You would not know.
Yeah, I mean,
so if you're doing it for health reasons or...
Well, okay, so on that, health reasons, we're all making the assumption that a mushroom sausage is better for you than a pork sausage because it's, got less saturated fat, etc. But it's a processed food, isn't it?
Yeah,
which actually, if you get a sausage which is whatever the highest percentage of meat is, 80%, maybe that's better for you than something that's been sort of put through a food processing plant and stuck in a freezer for a year.
Well, I think most sausages are fairly processed
sure,
unless you're buying
if you
decent
get a quality sausage.
Yeah, okay. But I think you can get decent quality veggie options. They don't have to be massively processed. It doesn't actually necessarily...
All of corn is massively processed, isn't it? It's a processed food.
I don't know that necessarily means it's bad.
It's not bad for you necessarily. I think you maybe have to consider more factors like, are you getting enough iron? Things that it is much more hard to get from foods other than meat, because it's harder for the body to process non-meat sources of iron.
Yeah, I mean, I think for vegetarianism, but also even more so for veganism, for it to be healthy and sustainable, it does have to come with what we're seeing now, which is more of a cultural evolution on what we eat and what a diverse array of things we eat. Because, back in the old days, if you were vegetarian, you probably weren't left with the most nutritious, appetizing choices on any menus.
Chips are vegetarian.
As long as you're getting, like you say, iron, protein, etc. from other sources, then it is a much healthier lifestyle.
I think the fact that we are more aware of those sort of nutritional needs also has probably, in a way, helped more people to become vegetarian because they now understand what it is they need to be eating.
What I wonder specifically from this report this week is I wonder if it's going to continue going in this direction. More and more people are going to be eating vegetarian meals, or whether we're going to hit, a meat wall, beyond which point...
Yeah, that's a Saturday night show I'd watch.
It's not the most appetizing phrase, but...
Bring Dale Winton back for that one.
Will it kind of plateau at a point where people aren't willing to give up any more meat, or is it going to continue in this direction till maybe half or even more of the meals we eat are
Have you guys seen Carnage, the Simon Amstell fake documentary that's on BBC, where I think it was the first thing, I highly recommend watching it because it was the first thing that made me really engage with the ideas of veganism and why it's such a ridiculous thing that we do eat meat and dairy and all of these problems. But he does it in such a good way of engaging with the topic and looking back at the kind of ideas behind meat eating, and so I highly recommend it's on iPlayer.
This is the thing, I think stuff like that, I remember being sent by vegetarian friends, when I was a teenager, they'd send you pictures of, like these horrible conditions, or like videos of like baby chicks being thrown in a grinder and all this kind of thing, and none of that stuff ever made me at all inclined to stop eating meat, but it is the cultural change towards eating more vegetarian,
being more
or
food aware,
veggie-based.
isn't
Yeah,
it?
but
So if we just to go back to the roots of the concept of this show, then this is your story of the week because it's evidence of an evolutionary change that you believe is long term.
Yeah, I think it's been a silent revolution. I think the average person probably wouldn't think that there's been a huge amount of motion, to or away from vegetarian veganism. There's more awareness of it, but I don't think the average person would think we're taking it up to as great an extent as we obviously are.
But every time they have spaghetti pesto, they are fighting the war.
People are becoming flexitarians without even realising it.
You do have to wonder if now that they can actually grow meat we're very close to growing meat in laboratories that have actually never been a live animal, whether that will swing it back.
Might be too late by then.
Yeah.
I have just given up meat entirely.
But wouldn't you still be a vegetarian if you were eating lab-grown meat anyway?
Well, I don't know. It's a moral... Again, that's an interesting moral issue. Is it...
I think
It's
if
not
it's
really
grown,
alive, is it?
If it's
Any more than
grown,
a
if it's
vegetable?
chemical based, I think that's fine.
If it's never been alive.
If it's never been, yeah.
It's just better corn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tastier corn.
Kari, you're up next. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Why isn't self-employment working?
You are launching consultations on them.
So what we're doing is we're enforcing the rights that people have. So employees and contracted workers are entitled to sick pay, but often the little guy doesn't have the ability to enforce the payments of those rights against an employer that wants to deny them. So what we're saying, just as we do with the minimum wage, we will make sure that they are enforced. Holiday
So this
pay
is the
and sick pay.
enforcement of existing rights rather
Correct.
than the conferring of new rights.
UK Business Minister Greg Clark speaking to Michelle Hussein on the BBC on Wednesday. Kari, the government want to clamp down on the big disruptors. So this is Uber and Deliveroo, companies like that. That we've heard before in other countries, haven't we? So what's the big turning point here?
Well, last year there was a review by Matthew Taylor, a former advisor to Tony Blair, released last July. And it was basically taking a new look at employment rights, because obviously the way our employment system works now has changed massively in recent years. And he made some recommendations that needed a clearer definition of what a worker is. At the moment, self-employed workers have no right to the minimum wage. You can pay them whatever you like. So he said they should at least get the minimum wage and ideally more. And also that there needed to be a system to enforce holiday and sick pay rights. And the government this week responded that they were meant to have done that in December, but it got postponed. And they're not actually doing a great deal. There's been a lot of anger about the lack of curbs on bogus self-employment. They're essentially just going to launch 4 more consultations. They're considering Taylor's proposals and they're tweaking the law. So they're not changing it. They're just saying, OK, we're going to enforce it now.
But it's not as straightforward as that sounds, is it? Because there's also some survey evidence out this week about self-employed people and the hours that they choose to work and the rights they choose to give up.
Well, I think this is a key point of this whole debate is, yeah, as you say, there was this survey of 1,000 self-employed or freelance workers, and they found they typically take just 14 days of holiday a year, and 1 in 8 take no holiday at all. On average, self-employed workers work an additional 14 hours a week compared to permanent roles. This is part of the problem, that there are really 2 kinds of self-employed workers. There's your people who have chosen to do this because they like the flexibility and, tend to be in more sort of skilled roles, and this works better for them. But then there are the people who've been forced into this because employees have realised that by saying someone actually isn't a full-time employee, they can get away with not paying sick pay and that sort of thing. And that's where you've got the gig economy.
But it's also it's important to make a distinction that, like, 0-hour contracts, that's not being self-employed. That's being employed by someone and then keeping you on a retainer. So a lot of the time people mix up the two and say that the people on 0-hour contracts, they are part of this idea of self-employed and they can choose and it's flexible, when actually they haven't got very much choice. They haven't got the ability to make...
Self-employed workers can be on 0 hours contracts. When Frank Field did his committee, they heard, one of the people they heard testimony from was a driver from Hermes, a delivery company, who said that after he requested his hours to be changed so he could take his terminally ill wife to hospital appointments, he stopped getting shifts from them. So, he had no right to basic
to anything that
contract.
kind of...
There's been such a change in how we work in this country. Self-employment has risen every year since 2000. We're now at the point where 1 in every 7 workers is self-employed, but it's so confusing. There's so many subcategories of employed, contractor. It's not clear, and I think that's part of the problem. We need new definitions of what employment means.
But there's also, as Jamie was suggesting there, some confusion about whether workers in this scenario have or have not opted into that lifestyle of working. I mean, we've all probably had that situation, I certainly have, where you end up having a conversation with your Uber driver about this. And, I'd say 2 in 3 times the Uber driver will say, this is a brilliant job for me. I'm studying and I get to do this when I want. Or I run a business from home and I do this in the evenings. And then 1 in 3 times they'll say, I don't get any sick pay. This is terrible.
The thing is that it used to be that surrendering up certain rights, like rights to, your holiday or sick pay, was the price you paid for the flexibility, which was something that not the majority of workers didn't really want. But because of the way we live now, there's 24-hour demand for services, especially things like Uber, Deliveroo, etc. People are required to work at different times. I think we've reached a point now where we can no longer say that flexibility is this great benefit which you'll pay for by surrendering your other rights. People need to work flexibly now, and we need people who are willing to work flexibly. It's no longer a privilege that you're giving something up in order to receive. We need workers like that. So I think that they should be entitled to.
What point do you say,
rights.
because you're using an internet service, that you are working, though? I mean, obviously, if you are doing it full-time, driving people around, you are a driver, that's clear. But if you're selling stuff on eBay and it's, your second-hand stuff, you're not a shop, are you? So there is a grey area in between those two things.
Yeah, and that's certainly something that, we'll have to regulate and understand and legislate. But the answer to that is to not just be like, okay, well, you're not a shop, so you don't get any of these rights, and end up with people like we had this week with the DPD guy who ended up dying.
Tell us that story. Kari, you're on top of this, right? So this is quite an extreme story of one DPD delivery driver.
Yeah, it's pretty horrific. This guy, who was only 53, he had diabetes, and he was a courier for the parcel company DPD. This company, if you miss your daily round, the drivers are fined £150 a day for missing that, because they're treated as self-employed franchises rather than as employees. And he missed key, very important appointments with his specialist, collapsed 4 times. After the second time he collapsed, he was still fined £150 for having missed even though he'd collapsed at the wheel of his van, and then went on, missed further appointments, and died as a result.
I think that what's interesting is that the people who say what an amazingly flexible opportunity this is and how great the benefits of freelance are. I was reading an article by Robert Colville in the Times today just before this, about talking, and he's from a right of centre think tank, and he was talking about how great the kind of flexibility is. They're often not the people that do the job. They're often not the people that are doing the freelance.
To be fair, it can be very, very helpful. Like, the number of freelancing mothers has soared in recent years. I think it's increased by something like almost 80% in less than a decade.
But I'm sure they would want more rights than less rights.
Yeah, that's the thing. It gives you that flexibility, but you need to sort of weave those rights into it.
But that's the core thing, is that a freelancer is theoretically supposed to be someone who has a skill that people are willing to pay for, and you're going out and you're offering someone to purchase your time and skill from you.
Flexibility benefits everyone. It should work both ways.
Whereas anyone physically capable could be an Uber driver or a delivery driver. That's not a case of you going out and offering your skills and being paid a fair amount for them. That's a case of it is bogus. They've got these companies have got hundreds or thousands of people working for them, basically in the exact same way that an employee working on varied shifts would work. They are, to all intents and purposes,
less overheads for Deliveroo and Uber.
Of course they're not, and this is the thing. It's one thing if you're a 20-year-old and you can work 50 hours a week delivering for Deliveroo, then that's great for you. If you've got no health problems and you're not worried about the future, you can make plenty of money doing it.
But you still don't know if you're going to earn any money the following week. I think it's risky for everyone.
Well, yeah, but what about what happens when you get sick? If you've got long-term illness, then you've got nothing to fall back on. So I'm not trying to,
But that goes for the highly skilled freelancers too.
Yes, that's true.
I was a freelancer for a year before I got this job. I was very lucky. I come from a very privileged position of having family that lived in London, so there wasn't such an issue of me living at home. But I mean, the truth is I took 10 days holiday. Because just because of the stress that it put me under in terms of wanting to always say yes to work. I earned more money that year than I did this year, so that's great.
You're now staff.
At the end, and I'm now staff, yeah. But at the end of the day, I was so worried about the instability of my work, and that's coming from a place of absolute privilege in terms of where I live and who my family are and everything like that. And even in that situation, I was worried about when I was going to get paid and how I was going to get paid and all of those things.
I had exactly the same thing. I was freelance for 1 year, made actually a lot more money than I did in the years afterwards when I got a staff job. But I worked to the point, I worked so many days in a row that I ended up passing out. And it's just that instability, that fear of just not knowing where your next wage is coming from.
And if you're the only breadwinner in a house, what life is that?
And also the pensions side of it as well happens when all of these people who are now in their 20s and 30s doing these jobs, like when they get to 65 or 70 or however old the retirement age is going to be, they haven't got a company pension that's going to pay out for them. Like, no one's paying into the national insurance. I think it's just going to be, it needs to be reformed as soon as possible because it's going to be a huge mess down the line.
Yeah, the whole system needs to be reformed in the UK and worldwide, actually. I think existing employment laws in many developed countries are just not fit for purpose anymore. The way we work has changed. Maybe not have employment laws, just have work laws.
And I don't want more admin. I already spend enough time filling in forms.
But does that necessarily have to mean more admin?
Yes. If there's more government regulation on me, I mean, this is why there was the outcry about freelancers paying more, was it?
National insurance.
National insurance last year, yeah, which was a proposal by the government in the budget, wasn't it? And then
Yeah,
got
it was
scrapped.
ditched, wasn't it? Yeah.
It's partly because there's just a feeling of, for the people who are the genuine freelancers, as you outlined, Rebecca, people, your sort of classic man with van scenario, those people need to spend as much time as possible doing the work and as little time as possible worrying about it.
But you would be the classic, what a freelancer is supposed to be, going around selling your skills to
This
different...
is a premium service.
Yeah,
I mean,
of
that much
course.
is clear.
Selling your skills to different companies, different employers. If you were just coming in, and doing this podcast for us every week and that was your only gig, and then the rest of us were all off on our holiday, eventually you'd think, why do I just keep coming here every day doing the same work as everyone else, but with none of the rights?
But the point is, if you change the rights, that would affect me as well as, the young ingenue starting out. That's the thing, isn't it?
Well, that's the
unfortunately,
challenge.
That's why the NI thing was scrapped, right? Because the Sun ran a campaign with, he's taxing the big white van man, this is why you shouldn't do it. And actually, the thing is that there needed to be some form of equality because, like Rebecca said, there is going to be a huge hole in the NI contributions of people.
I think what they need to introduce, ideally, and it would be quite complicated to do, I know, but is to introduce a maximum amount of weeks a year you could work for the same employer.
Because I think that, haven't they? But employers just get around it by saying, right, we'll go away for a month and then come back.
Yeah,
quite common
just going to have to
practice,
close
isn't it?
on those loopholes. I think it's maybe there is enough power in the existing laws then if they do enforce them more rigidly, because that's what it's about really, is working for the same employer as basically on a full-time basis and then being written off as a freelancer and getting none of the benefits.
I totally agree. But it's very difficult, isn't it? Because if you say, well, you can only employ someone for so long, well, fine. If you're in an industry where there's plenty of freelancers, you just rotate them, get rid of them, get someone new.
I point to our rotating panellists on this show. Jamie, it's you. Finishing us off this week, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
This was the week that we saw the return of the Godfather fighting the cause of the Italian jobless.
Associate with Berlusconi.
Yeah.
And yet, he maybe may come back, 81 years old.
I just want to read a quote that I found so fascinating by a professor of political history at a Roman university. We have been arguing that this was his last time so many times that we must be very careful. He's 81, so I assume that this is his last election, but he's resilient. The odds are to bet against him, but I would be very careful with any prophecy regarding the man.
Regarding the man.
Regarding
I mean, just the way
man,
he
capital
says
T, capital M.
The Bloomberg TV channel there reporting on the potential comeback in Italy of former President Silvio Berlusconi, Jamie. Surely not.
He's back. He is currently heading up a right-of-centre coalition. We're just a month out from the Italian elections, and it looks like the country is turning back towards a person who, pre-Trump, I think people would say was the most ludicrous politician on earth. Who can say, whether or not he is actually currently banned from holding office, but that doesn't stop him from being leader of a party. At the moment, he is the head of a coalition of what is nominally a centre-right party, his party, and two far-right parties.
Okay, so as we just heard, Bloomberg were reporting on this back in December. Why is this your story of the week this week?
So this week was quite a sad week in Italian politics. There was a drive-by shooting on immigrants in a town called Macerata, and it was perpetrated by it looks like now was an Italian fascist. He gave a Hitler salute when he got out of the car and said, Italy for Italians. Obviously, it was a targeted attack on immigrants. The reaction amongst politicians is the thing that was quite shocking. So Berlusconi, up until this point, had put across the opinion that he was someone who could soften the views of his far-right allies. But he came out and blamed the attack on the levels of immigration in the country. So he said 600,000 migrants are a social bomb that risks exploding. A lot of people were quite saddened to hear this because it kind of clearly shows that he's in hock to the far right in terms of what's going on in Italy at the moment. The broader question as we look towards the election is how the centre-left, or nominally the party, Matteo Renzi, who's the former prime minister, is part of the kind of the centre-left party, how he deals with immigration. He's already softened his views hardened his views on immigration, I should say, by saying that Italy should do more to help the people in their own countries, which is a a line that's kind of famous in the hard right.
But, I mean, there's almost two issues there, isn't there? Like, often around election time, immigration comes into focus in every country, doesn't it? It is a vote winner, basically, isn't it, to talk about immigration? Fair enough. In Italy, there have been, a lot of issues arising from rising levels of immigration recently. That's different, isn't it, to talking about fascism? And what you're talking about when you talk about a far-right allegiance that Silvio Berlusconi is heading up is something that's drifting towards the views of Mussolini in the 1930s.
Yes, and so for instance, this the perpetrator of this drive-by shooting was offered legal counsel by one of the parties in Berlusconi's alliance. A lot of people say about Italy that where Germany got rid of their leader in terms of Hitler, Italy never really got rid of Mussolini. Indeed, there is a film out this year, a satire talking about the return of Mussolini, what would happen if Mussolini came back. Italy, it seems to me at least, is ripe for the return of fascism.
Wow, okay, big claim. Let's talk about that. Kari.
Apparently, the attacker's own lawyer is saying that the level of support that the attacker's getting is alarming, that he's getting members of the public, the lawyer coming up to him saying, I think what he's done is actually great. And that is shocking.
Yeah, I mean, so Italy's main far-right parties, so Casa Pound, which when I lived in Rome, I actually lived opposite their headquarters, have said that this was, they've said that there's no excuse for this kind of attack with the classic but also immigration is bad at the end. But Forza Nuova, which is like a new far-right party, has offered to pay his legal expenses and has just hitched their wagon, if you will, to his star. But as you were saying, Jamie, it's like when the first time I went to Italy, there were market stalls where you could buy aprons and badges and things with Mussolini on them.
Did you ever have that conversation with an Italian?
I tried to avoid it. I mean, I always kept an eye on who was going in and out of Casa Pound opposite, but I mean, they did look very ordinary, so I suppose they were just blending in. Italy kind of almost reminds me of Japan in a way, where it's, until relatively recently, a very homogenous country that never quite made its peace with what happened during the Second World War. I feel like there's a strong current in Italian culture that they were like the victims of Hitler, just as much as everybody else was the victim of Hitler, rather than, being allied for so long. And they've never quite had that clean break with the fascist parts. If you remember, was it Paolo Di Canio used to give the fascist salute? There's a really strong current of fascism in Italian.
He was a footballer.
Yes, there's a really strong current of fascism in the Italian football supporter community as well still.
What's interesting, the Italian constitution actually forbids those sort of things. It forbids the promotion of any association that pursues the aims of a fascist party or anyone who exalts its principles. So actually, by law, they shouldn't be doing this, but no one has ever been prosecuted. A party last year that was founded by members of the Italian resistance movement against Mussolini, they drew up a list of 500 internet sites that were praising fascism in Italy and asked for them to block, and nothing was done.
I wonder if part of the issue is that no one, it's such a taboo that no one has challenged the viewpoints. There's an idea behind part of the reason why, these things come up again is because people are so afraid of saying what they think, and then no one's ever been challenged. And I'm strongly of the belief that the only way that you start up your own values and understand your own arguments is by being challenged in them. And I wonder if the fact that fascism has been part of the constitution and so outlawed, anti-fascism, but the idea of it has been so outlawed that actually the reason that it's still there is because people feel like they can't talk about it and they can't argue about it.
It's so deeply tied into Italian politics as well that, the concept of fascism, that basically all Italian right-wing parties are in some way intertwined with fascism or use language which echoes the rhetoric of fascism. And it's impossible not to.
You're going to have to just elaborate on that a little bit. All Italian parties are in some way tied in with fascism.
Yes, because...
So if you're on the left in Italy, you're tied in with fascism. How?
No, if you're on the right.
So all right-wing parties?
Yeah, because the thing is, because Italy...
There's no centrist conservative party in Italy, in your view?
No, there are parties who have centrist politics, but when you start talking about right-wing talking points in Italy, it's inherently imbued with associations with fascism because that rhetoric was such a huge part of Italy's history during the war. When you start using that same rhetoric, it has the echoes of fascism, and there's never been, like there has in Germany, that big clean break that, we can't ever return to this again. There is a real ambivalence about fascism and Mussolini and that past in Italy that there isn't in Germany.
They do have some cause for sympathy, not fascism, but the way that the EU has dealt with the problem of migration, have basically gone to Italy and said, it's up to you guys to just deal with this because you're the border that's closest to Africa. We're really sorry, but we're going to step back. And that has given off the impression, particularly to Italians and Italian politicians, that they are seen as the poor younger brother of the European Union. And actually, that has created resentment. So it's not just, we can't stand back and look and say, oh, it's Italy's fault. It is actually the way that the European Union has dealt with.
Yeah, they've been really disproportionately affected. And I think we haven't necessarily had the most honest representative coverage of that, like in the English speaking media, because what you get a lot is nice Guardian stories about, oh, this village was about to die out and then all these Libyans arrived or these Eritreans arrived and they've learned all the traditional crafts and they're helping revive glass blowing, which that has happened. I'm not saying those stories are made up. That's very nice, but
big fan of the glass blowing tab on the Guardian
point,
website.
I think the point being that a more accurate representation needs to take on board the fact that most Italians are not hugely in support of mass immigration and they're not hugely in support of diversity. I think they are slightly, I don't want to say behind us, but they have a different attitude towards diversity.
Well, they're more proud of their traditions, aren't they, perhaps, than English?
Yeah,
the economy has been struggling. They can't afford to take on, they could argue that they can't afford to take on lots of people.
The problem is that migrants, while their asylum seeker applications are running, and they're not the best at the best of times with admin, Italians, but while it's happening, they are unable to work. So you've just got lots and lots of people who are living in the country, migrants living in the country who are unable to work. And that's what they're saying. They're begging for jobs. They're begging for the ability to work.
The thing is that Italy needs them. The amount of Italian families are getting smaller, the workforce is aging, people still find ways to not pay their taxes, but they still want to retire early with a nice state pension, etc., etc. That system isn't sustainable without a big injection of young, hardy workers.
Okay, I'm just going to finish by asking you, Jamie, and bear in mind this is the show that around a year ago Holden Frith managed to predict President Macron. I'm going to ask you what your predictions are for the Italian elections on the 4th of March.
I mean, I think the key thing, as with it seems like all elections at the moment, is that there will be no party will win in a majority. I think actually, unfortunately, for the Liberals, it looks like Berlusconi's party will hold the balance of power, or the alliance will hold the balance of power.
So will we see President Berlusconi?
No.
Okay.
That can't happen at the moment. He's appealing currently to be able to hold office again, but at the moment he can't be.
Thank you. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jamie Timson and Kari Wilkin and Rebecca Gillie. For more from us at The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, where you can also sign up to our free email newsletter, The Weekday. Or, of course, you can have the magazine delivered direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And remember, you can get every episode of this podcast as soon as it's published. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.